saving the game, Snake? Hey, Snake, you ever heard of Godzilla, King of Monsters?
No, what is it?
It's a movie. You haven't seen it?
Nope.
It's about this monster called Godzilla, who grows to an enormous size in a nuclear test and goes on a rampage in Tokyo.
Nuclear test, huh? Then the Marshall Islands must be crawling with giant monsters right about now.
It's just make-believe.
Maybe that's why my pants have been so tight lately.
Snake, it's a movie, not a report out of Los Alamos.
I know, so then what happened?
Godzilla is immune to all weapons, and humanity has no way to stop the monster. Dr. Serizawa develops a new type of weapon, but meanwhile, Godzilla is getting closer and closer to Tokyo, obliterating everything in its path. It was originally a Japanese movie, but they made an American version too. I recommend seeing the original Japanese one if you ever get the chance. It's mostly mindless fun, but it's also got a serious anti-nuke message as well.
Where can I see the original?
You'll just have to go to Japan.
Really? That's too bad.
Well, if you wait 40 years, you might be able to see it in America too.
Why's that?
2004 will be Godzilla's 50th birthday.
You think they're still going to be making Godzilla movies then?
Of course! Everybody loves Godzilla.
You sure know a lot about movies.
I don't suppose you're the movie-watching type, are you?
Not really.
Okay, then I'll tell you everything I know. When the going gets tough, movies can save your life. It's always good to be able to look at things from a different perspective when you get in a jam. That's the magic of movies.
No kidding. Well, I guess it might at least make a nice distraction.
That's the spirit, Snake. Have a little fun.
On March 1st, 1954, the United States conducted a next-gen nuclear test in the Marshall Islands. Because the ensuing hydrogen bomb blast was several times more powerful than expected, a Japanese fishing boat, the Daigo Fukumaru, was caught in the fallout. The crew caught acute radiation syndrome, and when head radio operator Fubayama Aikichi died 6 months later, thanks to a bout of hepatitis from a subsequent dirty blood transfusion, his last words were, to quote Garrett M. Graff's Raven Rock, "Please make sure that I am the last victim of the bomb." It would be 1 month later that Ishiro Honda debuted a pop classic, one that would go on to directly inspire the anti-nuke message of Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid, the late 1954 film Gojira, known as Godzilla in the West. Godzilla may be known around the world today for its wacky innovation known as suitmation, where camera tricks and costumes are employed to portray giant monsters. But what gets lost is how this now considered silly technique first originated as an imaginative means of coping with the otherwise unspeakable and unportrayable horrors of nuclear annihilation. The film begins with a direct reference to the Daigo incident, as a peaceful civilian vessel is suddenly blighted by some mysterious eldritch horror rising with a flash of light from the deep sea. Today, of course, we all know going into the movie what this primeval disturbance will be. But the original Godzilla takes its time ramping up suspense, and only shows the giant lizard very briefly in the first half of the film. And most of it is actually about a Japanese public grappling with the intrusion of the unknown and with life in the post-war so-called nuclear age. The film follows a number of interrelated characters, from the kindly paleontologist Kyohei Yamane to his daughter Emiko and 2 men in her life, Hideto Ogata and Dr. Daisuke Serizawa. Emiko, as was Japanese custom prior to the US occupation that began in 1945, has been assigned a husband, Dr. Serizawa, by her father, Professor Yamane. However, once the disturbance at sea is revealed to be the giant lizard Godzilla, and Japan is sent into chaos, and soon the entire world with it, Emiko decides the time has come to ask her father permission to wed the man that she really loves, Hideto. Serizawa, who lost an eye fighting the Allies, has come back from the war a changed man. He shows Emiko a prototype weapon he's developed, and it terrifies her. All Serizawa cares about are mad science projects like these, even if they are ones that he insists remain shrouded in secrecy. Yet her father is no less obsessed, in his case with the question of how to stop the monster who begins to destroy island bridges and trains, despite the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force's best efforts, Godzilla. Professor Yamane throws Hideo Ogata out of his house during a heated exchange over Emiko, and with that, her hopes seem dashed. The task force that have assembled to defeat the giant lizard try to use a technique that uses electricity, but just when they think that this will at least phase the giant beast, Godzilla shows the world, in an attack on Tokyo, his dragon-like nuclear fire breath. With the electrocution plan a bust, it's only once a battalion of fighter jets zoom in as a distraction that the authorities can safely evacuate the civilians in Godzilla's path. The only option left is to try and use that secret method that Serizawa showed to Emiko, which strips water of its oxygen and liquefies any creature within its wake in an instant. She tells Hideo Ogata about this method, the man she really loves, and together they confront Serizawa, demanding that he use it to kill Godzilla. But Serizawa then reveals his true fear, that unveiling his discovery could lead the entire human race, should they weaponize it like they have nuclear energy, into its own self-destruction. I won't spoil the ending, but in the end, Emiko's wish is fulfilled, and Dr. Serizawa gets redeemed through a selfless act. This melodrama speaks to the massive generational and cultural shifts taking place in Japan since the war as of 1954. In 1947, a constitution established not only the democracy that we see in the film still as a burgeoning and unfamiliar presence in Japan, but specifically women's rights in terms of who to marry and how to vote. Godzilla makes this cultural shift one of its central themes through the interplay between modern science and the ancient and pre-modern past. Importantly, Dr. Yamane is a paleontologist, a scientist who uses modern methods to study and investigate beings who walked the Earth eons ago. One clue that he finds early on as to Godzilla's prehistoric origins is a trilobite fossil, an extinct marine organism that was wiped out during the Permian epoch's mass extinction event around 250 million years ago. This leads Yamane to conclude that Godzilla, whose massive monster footprints are radioactive, is some kind of evolution of an ancient sea beast who's been angered and unleashed by underwater nuclear tests. This discovery coincides with an earlier scene of several villagers from the fictional Odo Island, and an elder there who explains that for generations, they on the island ritualistically sacrificed girls to some terrible monster to protect their island, a monster they had called Godzilla. But now all that remains of this old custom is the ritual itself, as a kind of shibboleth. Could it be Godzilla is a punishment for the modernization and westernization of Japan? Has he been sent by the planet to protect the environment from the consequences of a possible nuclear holocaust? Or is Godzilla merely a freak accident, a mutant born from the eldritch terrors of radiation? It's never completely explained. But whatever the true cause and nature of the beast, this horrifying ambiguity about Godzilla seems to directly relate to fears within Japanese society at the time surrounding radiation. Survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks were dubbed hibakusha, and they were stigmatized and shunned no less than their ancestors are today. Urban myths about radiation persist even now, as some Japanese still believe radiation poisoning could be contagious or hereditary. This same stigma affected the survivors of the Daigo Fukumaru incident, in fact. Some of this mass hysteria had to do with the secretive nature of nuclear weapons, and the grim reality that the atomic bombs dropped on the country were done so mainly as a sort of science experiment. It would be decades, in fact, before the full epidemiological impact of the bombs would be accounted for in terms of things like cancer rates and birth defects. This controversial and disturbing contemporary issue would be directly alluded to in Godzilla. Upon exposure to the fire and fury of Godzilla's atomic dragon breath, Tokyo's shelters and hospitals bulged just as they did during the war to fit all the wounded, the radiation sick, and the dead. Surely the nighttime scenes, illuminated by a Tokyo ablaze, would have unmistakably conjured to mind in 1954 the still present memory of the quote single deadliest air raid of World War II, according to Wired magazine, the March 1945 Tokyo air raids, also known as the Night of the Black Snow. The way we see Japanese aircraft valiantly distracting the giant monster to buy Tokyo time could be a veiled nod to the Imperial Army Air Service, who struggled in vain against the Allies to only temporarily halt their advance across the Pacific Ocean and onto Japanese shores. Godzilla is to some degree an invasion story, after all, and its subtle relevance to the Pacific War speaks to the heavy censorship that Japan formerly faced under the American occupation, ending in 1952, when it came to any material that could be construed as of an explicitly pro-empire bent. None of what I'm saying is an endorsement of this hypothetical reading of Godzilla as vaguely themed around Japan's defeat in World War II, nor do I think even in theory that Godzilla is somehow anti-American or pro-imperial. The Empire of Japan, since the Meiji Restoration at the end of the 19th century, had been rapidly abandoning its pastoral traditions anyway, in a bid to become more worldly and competitive. Yet that march towards progress, ironically, descended in the 30s and 40s into totalitarianism and total war, bringing the once feudal country back into a version of its highly militant and oppressive past. So if anything, Godzilla can only be read sociologically if we read it as a cathartic confrontation by a notoriously closed-off society through metaphor with its own monsters and demons. The burgeoning atmosphere of the Cold War during the 50s, which the film does directly address, resembled a globalized version in some ways of the Sengoku era in Japan that lasted from 1467 to 1615. It is the universal human impulse to construct ever more superweapons and amass ever-growing expanses of every form of power that the film portrays as our race's own gravest threat. After all, one way or another, Godzilla is a consequence of this human folly, one that Dr. Serizawa can only redeem himself of as a former combatant by protecting us all from it, both Japan but also the entire world. The film posits that Godzilla, a primordial creature, was only reawakened thanks to nuclear tests. If these tests continue, we're told, more Godzillas will inevitably result. The influence of Godzilla on MGS is so extensive as to be ubiquitous. For starters, the titular giant doomsday machine, Metal Gear, is a kind of Godzilla, a nuclear-born monstrosity who will continue to return as long as nuclear weapons remain a threat. The way that the movie shows an investigation of its monster with pseudo-realistic science fiction elements and blends together its central conflict with social and political melodramas would be roughly repeated in each and every Metal Gear Solid. In the MSX Metal Gears, for example, Snake has to learn gradually about the existence and the weak points of Metal Gear before you can take it down. And though it wouldn't become really pronounced until the Metal Gear Solid era, from the beginning, this series was about questioning whether, like Dr. Serizawa, your cure wasn't as bad or even worse than the disease. In Metal Gear Solid 1, the comparison between Metal Gear and Godzilla became greater and more explicit, as it was revealed that the development of Metal Gear Rex was a kind of reaction to the rapid proliferation of nuclear materials from waste to scientists that emerged after the Cold War. Rex is a kind of sentinel who exists to defend the status quo by threatening terrible damage on any who try to harm it. Somewhat like how Godzilla, the film implies, functions both as a protector of the planet against the horrors of nuclear experimentation, as well as being a horrifying byproduct of it. In Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, Metal Gear Ray became, like Godzilla, an amphibious entity somewhere between alien and primeval in appearance. The scene where Ray destroys the USS Discovery using his laser breath echoes Godzilla's own dragon-like abilities. And the melodrama between characters Jack and Rose, or Hal and EE, in the midst of the wider plot of forensic science fiction and its objective of diverting disaster, all feel very true to Godzilla in spirit, if not in actual form. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater gave us the most direct references to Godzilla of all the games, drawing, as it did, a direct link between the monster and not the giant robot this time, but the protagonist, Naked Snake, who, following exposure to radiation, during the exact same hydrogen bomb test in the 50s that poisoned that crew of Japanese fishermen, which had inspired Godzilla, will go on to menace the world as a different kind of nuclear-powered monster, the menace known as Big Boss. MGS4 was maybe less indebted to the film, but with the final run of games, from Peace Walker to the Phantom Pain, Godzilla's influence returned with a vengeance. And all throughout MGS over the years, Godzilla never remained far from the series' themes and motifs. Even the film's innovative use of pre-CGI effects, sets, and costumes, all of which allowing scenes to be shot in real time instead of them having to be stitched together in the editing booth, foreshadowed how MGS would also use cutting-edge tech and techniques to prioritize real time. But the largest inheritance bestowed by Godzilla onto MGS has to be its use of outlandish pop science fiction to get at very real events, traumas, and fears ripped right out of today's and tomorrow's headlines. Godzilla, as a kind of forensic disaster movie, serves as a warning for future generations never to become complacent when it comes to nuclear weapons. The same, of course, is true of MGS. Until next time, boss.